Pope Francis's final letter remained unopened. No cardinal laid eyes on it. No assistant touched its seal. Even his own sister, Maria Elena, was unaware of its contents. The letter was left in silence, tucked away beneath a plain white linen pillow. It rested in the pontiff's private chamber within the Casa Santa Marta. The most astonishing fact was its intended reader. This was not a letter meant for human eyes. Only a single creature knew of its existence: Balthazar. Balthazar was a mixed-breed dog. His gaze held a quiet depth, a silence reminiscent of a monk. He had been the Pope's steadfast companion, staying by his side until the very last breath. The morning following Pope Francis's passing cast a somber quiet over the Vatican. A profound mourning settled in the air, punctuated only by the hushed whispers of prayers. Into this stillness, Balthazar entered the empty room. He didn't explore the furniture with his nose. He didn't let out a single bark. His path was direct, leading him straight to the bed. Slowly, deliberately, he climbed onto the mattress. He nudged his snout beneath the familiar pillow. There, nestled between the soft fabric and the lingering scent of his beloved master, he found it, the envelope. He lay down upon the letter, and then he cried. His tears were silent, a profound expression of grief. It was as though he instinctively understood that this simple piece of paper held something far more significant than mere words. It contained a farewell, a final goodbye that his loyal heart was not yet prepared to embrace. In the last days of Pope Francis's life, access to the quiet intimacy of his resting room was strictly limited. Massimiliano, one of the attending nurses, recounted a poignant moment. One evening, just before sleep, claimed the Pontiff, Francis spoke in a low, frail voice. "When I die," he instructed softly, "there is a letter. Do not let anyone touch it. Only Balthazar." At the time, Massimiliano considered the possibility that it was merely a touch of delirium, a wandering thought common at the end of life. However, on the morning the Holy Father departed, while discreetly tidying the bed, the nurse discovered the envelope. It bore no name, only the simple, hand-drawn symbol of Saint Francis of Assisi sketched in a corner. Recalling the Pope's specific instruction, Massimiliano left the letter precisely where he had found it, respecting the final wish. In the ensuing days, Balthazar lost his appetite. He refused all food, even his most cherished treat, a special biscuit subtly flavored with lavender. He turned away from every offering. His days were spent beside the now empty bed, his gaze fixed unwaveringly upon the pillow. He sat as if in vigil, perhaps waiting for his master to reappear, to utter the familiar words, "Come on, let's go for another walk." A wave of quiet intrigue rippled through the Vatican. The existence of the letter, designated for the dog alone, was a source of gentle curiosity, yet an unspoken reverence surrounded it. No one dared to disturb it. It felt as though this final act of the Pope was sacrosanct, reserved for a unique form of communication, a dialogue intended solely for two souls intertwined by a bond that transcended language. The nuns tasked with cleaning the Pope's room observed Balthazar's behavior with quiet tenderness. They noted how he consistently chose to sleep in the exact spot on the bed where Francis used to rest his hand during the night. It was a precise, dedicated space, almost as if the dog were guarding the residual warmth, the lingering presence, the very spirit of his departed friend. Whispers soon began to circulate through the hushed corridors of Santa Marta. Speculation arose about the letter's contents. Could it hold a final, startling revelation? A profound act of forgiveness? Perhaps a long-held secret dating back to the Pope's earlier years in Buenos Aires. Yet, those who had known Francis intimately understood his nature. He was a man defined by simplicity. His final words were unlikely to be crafted for dramatic effect. They would be intended for comfort, and perhaps they were directed towards the one being who had always understood him most completely, even without the need for spoken language. One pre-dawn morning, an internal security camera captured an unusual sight. Balthazar was seen entering the private chapel, alone. He walked calmly to the front and sat down directly before the altar. For 20 minutes, he remained perfectly still. He didn't shift his position. He didn't make a sound. His eyes were wide open, alert, as if he were listening intently to something imperceptible to human ears. Within the Vatican's walls, the letter began to acquire a unique name, the invisible letter. It was the letter that could only be felt, not read in the conventional sense. This moniker only deepened the surrounding mystery. Why would the Pope compose a letter destined never to be opened and read by human eyes? But perhaps that was precisely the intention. A communication designed not for visual interpretation, but for the heart, and even for the sense of smell. Indeed, whenever Balthazar approached the envelope and inhaled its scent, his reaction was palpable. It was as if each subtle aroma conjured vivid memories. A leisurely stroll through the Vatican gardens, a quiet afternoon spent indoors during a rainstorm, the gentle reassurance of a familiar embrace. It became increasingly clear. The letter held the most personal farewell imaginable, a goodbye conveyed without words, because the purest forms of love often render them unnecessary. Balthazar's origins were humble. He hadn't been acquired from a prestigious breeder or adopted from a fashionable rescue organization. He boasted no noble lineage, nor had he received specialized training within monastic walls. Balthazar was simply found discovered shivering and soaked on a turbulent, stormy afternoon. He was barely more than a puppy then, with large, soulful eyes and hopelessly tangled fur caked in mud. One of his hind legs was clearly injured, causing him pain. His rescuer was Sister Genevieve, a French nun whose life was devoted to caring for street children and abandoned animals. She was serving on a mission in Argentina at the time. Spotting the tiny, trembling creature huddled amongst overflowing garbage bags, her compassion stirred instantly. She didn't hesitate. She gently gathered him up and carried him back to the safety of the convent. There, she meticulously cleaned his wounded leg and patiently fed him warm milk over several days, nursing him back to health. The name she chose for him, Balthazar, was rather unique. She explained her choice by saying the puppy's gaze seemed ancient, as if he had already undertaken a long and arduous journey. Like one of the Magi, she would often remark with a gentle smile. Several months passed. By then, Jorge Bergoglio had become Pope Francis and resided in the Vatican, though he maintained regular contact with Sister Genevieve. When the nun eventually visited Rome, she brought Balthazar along. Upon entering the Casa Santa Marta, the dog displayed remarkable composure. He didn't bark or show any signs of anxiety in the unfamiliar surroundings. Instead, he walked with quiet purpose directly towards Pope Francis. He sat down respectfully in front of the pontiff and looked up, meeting his gaze directly. The connection was immediate, undeniable. It was a moment of profound recognition, as if two souls destined to meet had finally found each other after years of searching. From that day forward, Balthazar was inseparable from Pope Francis. The stern Swiss guards quickly grew accustomed to the sight of the small, four-legged shadow faithfully trailing His Holiness through the historic corridors. Balthazar would often sit discreetly on the wooden benches during services in the chapel, and he frequently waited with quiet patience just outside the doors during official meetings. He seamlessly became an integral part of the Vatican's daily life, an unassuming invisible guardian. While loved by many within the Holy See, his heart belonged entirely to one person. Each morning, Pope Francis had a ritual. He would read passages from the Gospel aloud. His audience wasn't the assembled cardinals or visiting bishops, it was Balthazar. Because he listens with his heart, the Pope would explain simply to anyone who inquired. During the quiet hours of evening prayer, the dog would lie peacefully beside the Pope, his eyes gently closed, almost as if he were joining in the devotion. His favorite sleeping spot was at the foot of the Pope's bed, always in precisely the same place, transforming it into his own personal, sacred altar. It wasn't uncommon for priests to whisper amongst themselves that Balthazar seemed to possess a deeper understanding of the liturgy than some human attendees. One particularly harsh winter, Balthazar fell seriously ill. A sudden, aggressive infection ravaged his small body, robbing him of his appetite and vitality. For days, he lay weak and listless. The Vatican summoned the best veterinarians and dedicated caretakers, but the one who kept vigil through the longest night was Pope Francis himself. The pontiff sat patiently on the cool floor beside Balthazar's improvised bed. He gently held the dog's small, bandaged paw in his hand, offering quiet words of comfort. "Be strong, brother," he murmured softly. "You have more soul than many humans I have encountered in this life." These heartfelt words resonated through the Vatican corridors for days afterward. When Balthazar finally began to recover, though still visibly frail, Pope Francis greeted the improvement with a smile of profound relief. like someone witnessing a small personal miracle. Yet, time marches relentlessly forward, even for the most devoted souls. As the years unfolded, Pope Francis began to exhibit signs of increasing frailty. His steps grew shorter, more measured. His breathing became more labored, and Balthazar, ever perceptive, seemed to sense each subtle decline before anyone else. His companionship became even more attentive, more watchful. He no longer bounded ahead or engaged in playful antics. He simply walked beside his master in quiet solidarity, as if silently absorbing the discomfort the Pope tried so hard to conceal. During the final public Mass celebrated by Pope Francis, Balthazar was present, as always. He sat near the altar, perfectly still. When the great bells of St. Peter's tolled, he remained silent. When the assembled crowd erupted in applause, his tail remained motionless. His gaze was fixed solely on the Pope's face. It was a look of profound understanding, as if his loyal heart was already bidding a silent farewell, respecting the solemnity and mystery of that sacred occasion. Following that Mass, Pope Francis retreated to his private quarters and did not emerge again. Balthazar, sensing the shift, began sleeping even closer to his master than before. He would sometimes gently rest his muzzle on the Pope's pillow, as if trying to capture and preserve the very last traces of his breathing. It was during one of these quiet nights, with the soft glow of the moon illuminating the room, that Pope Francis reached for paper and pen. With hands that trembled slightly from age and fatigue, his eyes fixed lovingly on his faithful four-legged friend, he composed his final letter. When finished, he spoke no word but carefully folded the single sheet of paper. He then discreetly drew the simple emblem of Saint Francis in the corner before hiding the envelope beneath the pillow. Balthazar observed this entire process with his usual quiet attentiveness. He did not approach the bed or interfere. He simply lay down nearby and waited, ever patient, ever present. That letter, soon to become the focal point of one of the Vatican's most touching and unusual stories, had been penned with one singular, heartfelt intention: to be felt, truly felt, by the one being who would comprehend its essence without ever needing to break the seal, because some farewells transcend the need for spoken words. They require only the shared presence of one who never faltered during times of sorrow, one whose steady, silent companionship offered unwavering comfort. As the days turned into weeks, the Pope's absence solidified into a palpable, heart-wrenching reality. Balthazar, ever the creature of habit and loyalty, continued his established routine. He would enter the room, approach the bed, and gently sniff the pillow. He would then lie down beside the bed, sometimes remaining there for hours on end, his gaze occasionally drifting towards the door, a flicker of hope perhaps still alive in his devoted heart. He behaved as if, on some deep level, he sensed the story was not quite finished. The Vatican remained steeped in a heavy silence, an atmosphere that seemed to press down on the ancient stone walls like a thick, persistent fog. The departure of Pope Francis had created not just a profound spiritual emptiness, but a deeply felt human one as well. Amidst the many individuals mourning discreetly within the shadowed corridors, there was one whose grief manifested not in tears, but in a profound, unwavering, silent sorrow: Balthazar. The dog's loyalty remained absolute. In the days immediately following Francis's final farewell, Balthazar adhered strictly to his routine. He would enter the Pope's room, sniff the familiar pillow, lie down beside the bed, and often stay for extended periods. He continued to refuse food, even the special biscuits offered by Sister Genevieve, the treat he had once loved. It was as if a vital part of him had ceased to exist along with the Pope, or perhaps something deep within his canine soul was still holding on, waiting for a final sign, a concluding gesture. 2 days after the funeral, a small, informal gathering took place. It included a few members of the Papal Guard, several nuns who had been close to Francis, and a handful of cardinals. The subject was the white envelope, still resting undisturbed beneath the pillow. It lay exactly where Francis had placed it, protected solely by the silence and the Pope's clearly expressed desire that it remain untouched. Father Massimiliano reiterated the Pope's words. His Holiness was very clear. He reminded the small group, "That letter is for Balthazar. No one else is to open it." A collective sense of understanding passed through the room. Heads nodded in agreement. No one present possessed the audacity to contradict the final wish of the man who had guided the church with such remarkable humility and unwavering faith. However, Sister Genevieve, whose connection to Francis stretched back to his years in Buenos Aires, couldn't shake the image of Balthazar's eyes. There was an undeniable depth in those soulful brown orbs, a look that seemed to plead for something more than mere nostalgic remembrance. She sensed the dog was waiting, anticipating something further, perhaps one last, definitive gesture, or maybe the simple release that acknowledgement could bring. Later that afternoon, as the setting sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the stained glass windows of the private chapel, Genevieve approached the Pope's bed. Balthazar was already there, in his customary spot. She knelt down beside him, stroking his head with gentle tenderness. Wordlessly, she reached beneath the pillow. The envelope felt cool and thin to her touch, yet it possessed a palpable weight, an energy that emanated not from the paper itself, but from the presence it contained. She held it delicately between her fingers for a few moments, her gaze meeting Balthazar's. The dog lifted his muzzle, watching her intently. Then, for the first time since the Pope's passing, his tail offered a slight, almost imperceptible wag. "Maybe," Genevieve whispered softly, more to herself than to the dog, "just maybe, we should read it with you." Later, in the chapel, Balthazar didn't bark, but his breathing became noticeably quicker, shallower. It was as if he possessed an innate understanding of the significance of the moment about to unfold. That same night, long after the Coser Center martyr had fallen into deep slumber, Sister Genevieve walked silently through the darkened corridors, the precious envelope held carefully in her hands. The only illumination came from the sanctuary lamp burning steadily in the side chapel, a solitary flame flickering bravely amidst the pervasive darkness of grief. Balthazar padded along silently beside her, his paws making no sound on the cool marble floors, just as he had walked beside Francis countless times over the years. Upon entering the chapel, Genevieve settled onto the bench closest to the altar, clutching the letter against her chest. Balthazar lay down quietly at her feet. There they remained, the two of them, in the quiet presence of God, holding a shared secret, bound by a connection that defied ordinary explanation. She studied the simple, hand-drawn seal, the small, pencil-sketched symbol of Saint Francis of Assisi, rendered with love and simplicity. "I will not betray his will," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I know that you need this more than anyone." Balthazar lifted his head, his eyes appearing moist in the dim light. Taking a slow, deep breath, Genevieve resolved her course. "This isn't betrayal," she reassured herself softly. "It's an act of love." With painstaking care, she slid her fingers beneath the flap of the envelope and gently eased it open. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, neatly folded into 3 sections. There was no visible signature, only the distinctive, slightly trembling handwriting of someone acutely aware of the imminent weight of farewell. She didn't read the words aloud just yet. Instead, she held the paper reverently in both hands, as one might hold a sacred relic. Balthazar shifted closer, nudging the paper gently with his nose. Then, with a long, deep sigh, he settled down again, resting his head trustingly on Genevieve's feet. A lump formed in her throat. The very air in the chapel seemed still, suspended in time. Closing her eyes briefly, she offered a silent prayer for wisdom. Then, with the deliberate care one might use when opening a holy book, she slowly unfolded the single sheet. Her hands trembled slightly, yet when she began to speak, her voice emerged clear and steady. She wasn't reading for herself, nor for the world outside. She was reading for Balthazar. In that sacred moment, she knew she was acting as a bridge between two souls, one who had departed, and one who remained behind. The chapel was enveloped in absolute silence, broken only by the soft rustle of the paper in Sister Genevieve's hands as she knelt before the small altar table. Balthazar was beside her, his presence calm and steady. He pressed his body gently against hers, a silent affirmation. "I am here. I understand." The gentle glow from the sanctuary lamp cast a soft light upon the letter, making the ink seem to shimmer faintly. Genevieve took another steadying breath. The words felt intensely personal, almost burning, even before she gave them voice. She instinctively knew this wasn't a theological treatise or a set of instructions for the cardinals. This letter transcended the structures of the church. It was purely about love, about the unseen, unbreakable thread connecting two souls who had found solace in each other's company until the very end. Her voice low, imbued with the reverence of prayer, Genevieve began to read. Balthazar. At the sound of his name, Balthazar slowly raised his head. His gaze was intensely focused on the paper, as if each syllable unlocked a flood of cherished, long-held memories. Thank you for every silence filled with peace. Tears welled in the nun's eyes as she read these words. She had been a witness to those shared silences, the quiet mornings when the Pope would simply sit, gently stroking the dog's head while gazing thoughtfully out the window. She had felt the palpable calm that descended upon the room whenever Balthazar rested his muzzle comfortingly on the pontiff's weary legs. For listening to me when even I didn't want to speak. A tearful smile touched Genevieve's lips. It was undeniably true. In his final months, Pope Francis had grown increasingly quiet, his words fewer, but Balthazar had remained a constant, attentive listener. He would sit nearby, ears alert, simply offering his unwavering presence, for waiting for me every day as if it were the first. Her mind flashed back to the countless times the Pope had departed for official functions. Balthazar would invariably settle himself by the door, waiting with unshakable patience, never moving until Francis returned. And his greeting was always the same pure, unbridled enthusiasm, a joyful sparkle in his eyes. God created you so I would not forget what it means to love without asking anything in return. Genevieve's voice trembled slightly on these words. Balthazar lay completely still now, stretched out beside her, his muzzle resting peacefully on his paws, his eyes still fixed on the letter, almost as if he could see his own essence reflected in the handwritten lines. If someday they feel your absence, tell them, I was never closer to God than when I was beside you. The final words drifted into the chapel's profound silence, hanging in the air like a delicate, sacred veil. A quietness settled, simultaneously heavy with emotion and light with understanding. Genevieve slowly lowered the sheet of paper, pressing it gently against her chest. Balthazar didn't stir, simply closing his eyes. She watched him for several long moments, the silence unbroken. Time itself seemed to pause. Then, as if moved by an invisible current, the dog rose slowly to his feet. He took a deliberate step forward and gently, reverently, rested his muzzle directly upon the letter lying on the altar cloth. He remained there, perfectly still, breathing deeply and evenly, as if, at long last, he had found complete peace and could finally rest. Tears streaming down her face, Genevieve whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He understood. Balthazar opened his eyes. He glanced at her for a brief instant, a look of deep knowing passing between them. Then he lay down once more. This time, however, he didn't settle at her feet, but positioned himself right beside the letter, his warm body gently touching the paper. Genevieve reached out and stroked his fur tenderly, feeling the comforting warmth of the loyal animal mingling with the lingering energy of the heartfelt farewell. She knew with absolute certainty that something profound had been completed, that, in some inexplicable way, a cycle had reached its gentle conclusion right there, in the profound simplicity of that gesture, in the deep resonance of that shared silence. The letter Pope Francis had penned for his beloved dog was never intended to reshape the world or alter the course of history. Its purpose was far more intimate, yet universally resonant. It served as a quiet reminder that the purest, most selfless form of love, the kind of love that perhaps brings us closest to the divine, might just reside in the trusting, unwavering gaze of a dog who asked for nothing but companionship, yet gave his entire being in return. Genevieve remained seated in the quiet chapel for hours that night. She didn't recite formal prayers. She simply felt. She felt the profound connection, the completion of the reading not by her, but through her, for Balthazar. She sensed that the Pope's words had bypassed intellect and reason, traveling directly to the heart of the only recipient truly capable of grasping their meaning without need for translation. The air felt strangely lighter, the weight of grief subtly lessened, though the inherent mystery remained sacred and untouched. She knew she would never share the specific words of the letter with anyone else. It would be carefully refolded, returned to its envelope, and kept safe, but something fundamental had shifted. Balthazar would no longer gaze forlornly at the empty pillow, searching for answers he couldn't find. He had received the only answer that truly mattered. His love was real, acknowledged, and cherished until the very last breath. Rising slowly, Genevieve carefully smoothed the precious page and gently placed it back within the envelope. Balthazar followed her silently as she walked back towards the dormitory. That night, for the first time since Pope Francis's departure, he slept deeply and peacefully. Before extinguishing the light, Genevieve looked over at the sleeping dog and whispered into the quiet darkness, "Sometimes, heaven disguises itself on four paws." A gentle smile touched her lips. She knew deep within her soul that not all miracles arrive with thunderous pronouncements or grand displays. Some unfold quietly, gently, like a loyal muzzle resting peacefully upon a final letter, and held within that simple, scent-laden piece of paper was perhaps Pope Francis's ultimate lesson, one that required no pulpit, no sermon. Because those who truly love have no need to convince others. The authentic gospel, the one that truly transforms hearts, resided in every faithful step Balthazar took, in every patient vigil he kept, in every shared silence with the man who never sought applause, only presence. And in that quiet understanding, love had indeed spoken louder than death itself. The letter, written to be felt rather than read, had fulfilled its sacred mission, ensuring that love endured,